Can everybody hear? Yeah. Thanks very much for coming out on a Saturday. It's really appreciated. Myself and Peter would both like to thank Teresa, Virginia, and everybody in Cornwall for the warm welcome this week. And we'd especially like to thank and acknowledge, as Teresa said, Denzel Forrester, who's here tonight, and whose exhibition opened last night at St. Just. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, please do, because it's extraordinary. Tonight's talk between myself and Peter, we've decided to structure it in a sort of a semi-autobiographical way. Myself and Peter have known each other for 26 years, so it's 3 decades. And we've structured the talk around 8 of Peter's works, made between 1990, when he graduated from Chelsea School of Art on the MA program, and 2017, a painting from his most recent solo exhibition in New York. And hopefully along the way, we'll have an opportunity to talk about the circumstances in which Peter made those works, some of the things that were going on in his life and that he was thinking about that probably or perhaps influenced or informed those works. And then hopefully we can also think about some of the other things that are happening around us for both Peter and myself during that time. So by way of a kind of sort of prelude, I'll just introduce the first painting, which is up on the screen now, and it's called Hitchhiker, and it's from 1990. And Peter just told me, I actually didn't know that it's painted on
postal bags,
stitched
together.
Postal bags that were stitched together, which I'm sure was partly aesthetic and partly poverty.
Partly aesthetic and partly a way to be able to paint on linen when you couldn't afford to buy the real stuff.
Okay. But I'm just going to give a quick biographical sketch. I think a lot of Peter's history is well known, or at least well published, so we won't spend too much time on the preamble. But Peter was born in 1959, and often I notice in the press, especially the British press, even up until this week, he's referred to as a Scottish painter. So Peter was born in Edinburgh in 1959, but he left Edinburgh in 1960, so he spent precisely 12 months. But that 12 months determines that he's a Scottish painter. Maybe we'll come back to that. It's like the Scottish play. 1960, Peter and his family moved to Trinidad, which would obviously, and I think as you're aware, would recur in his life, and it obviously has a very significant presence in both his personal life and the work that he makes now. He would move again to Trinidad in 2002. We will come to that later. 1966, his family moves to Canada, Toronto area, and in 1979, Peter moves to London to go to foundation, first at Wimbledon.
First at Wimbledon, yes.
For a foundation course.
Well, I actually came to London for a year prior to the foundation. Yeah, but I did do the foundation course. Yeah, that same year.
What were you doing in the year when you went to art school?
Just living in London and working and making a portfolio.
Okay. And then in 1982-83, he does a BA at St. Martin's, as it was at the time, and stays in London, but in 1986 returns to Canada, this time living in Montreal. 3 years later returns to London in 1989 to enter the MA program at Chelsea and graduates in 1990. And this painting was a part of his graduate degree show at Chelsea at that time. It's a painting that he still owns. I think one significant cultural event that might set the stage for you, perhaps to say a little bit about this painting and your time at Chelsea, is in the summer of 1988. Damien Hirst and his colleagues organised an exhibition called Freeze in London's Docklands, which I happened to be at the opening of, and thus began the sort of mythology around what became known as the YBA generation, the Young British Artist generation. So I just, would just begin, Peter, by saying, about your time at Chelsea and the time that you were making this painting and the things you were looking at, the things that were interesting to you.
Well, I had been living in Montreal for 3 years prior to attending Chelsea, And I can remember I arrived back in London like literally 2 days before the start of the course. And I'd been working in film mainly as a set painter. And my practice as an artist had really been put to the side because it just took up so much time, and I hardly had any free time to make my own work. And that was one of the decisions to go back to school, because I was quite old. I was over 30, and I felt that I needed to do something quite drastic to stop working and to just start painting again, and giving myself another chance, as it were, to see if I could be an artist full time. So I started Chelsea. It's a 1-year course, which some of you may know, and I hadn't really been aware really of the changes in the art world in Britain, and probably hadn't really cared, to be honest, until I arrived at Chelsea. And I can remember, for instance, making paintings. The first paintings I made, this being one of the first ones I thought that was actually a sort of successful finished painting, and then entering them in to the New Contemporaries quite cheekily, because I'd been a New Contemporary in 1982 and 1983, but then I applied again in 1989, and actually one of my friends was one of the judges, and she just said, "Peter, not a chance, not a chance." He said, "We're not looking at this type of stuff anymore." But anyway, that I felt that I was doing something quite different to what was being done in the kind of in the world where people were getting exhibitions, and people were being talked about. Contemporary art, I guess, contemporary painting.
And did that concern you at the time, whilst you were making the work, or was that sort of paradoxically an incentive to keep going?
It didn't really bother me. I felt I was very much outside of it, but I also felt it was a challenge, in a sense, to try and do what I wanted to do. And for me, actually, this painting was quite different to things I'd done prior. It was so much simpler than what I'd done prior, and it was so reduced subject-wise and narrative-wise. The narrative was, in a way, was a kind of an experiment to make a painting that, deliberately allowed the viewer to bring their interpretation into the painting. And I can remember when I made this painting, the truck element didn't exist for close to 3 weeks, and people would be coming into my studio, and they didn't really know my work, and they were just, and I hadn't, as I said, I hadn't made work quite like this before, but they thought I was making some sort of drippy, sort of landscape-esque painting. And then I cut out of the truck I painted it on paper first, and I pinned it on. And I can remember a few people coming into the studio and looking at it quite surprised and say, "You can put that on that painting?" And I said, "Yes, this is the painting. This was the scene for this." And at the time it did look very odd, and I suppose it was influenced probably even by things like what Jeff Koons was doing, the Jim Beam trains and things like that, and sort of these very sort of ordinary objects that you sort of looked at and think, does this belong in the world of art? These kind of these very plain, but then trying, in a sense, also in a way to try and create an atmosphere in a way.
I think also this painting, 1990, and the couple of years that would follow in the very early 90s, you make paintings that are largely understood to have a Canadian subject, or in this case it would appear to be a North American Canadian subject. And it's also the beginning, I think, of you introducing a sort of filmic reference. I don't know if the film The Hitcher had come out at this point, the sort of horror film, but later you would incorporate image from Friday the 13th and so on. And again, these were somewhat unusual narrative motifs for somebody making paintings in London at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was very aware of where the place was when I made this painting, the place in the painting. It's a stretch of highway close to where my family lived. It stretches essentially between Montreal and Toronto. And it's a very sort of fairly bleak, boring piece of road. It's very straight. And this was a truck I saw on the road. And in a way, I wanted to just set this scenario that that one could, imagine either the worst or nothing happening, really.
We'll move to the next image, thanks. We're now in 1991, so exactly a year later, and Peter's work was nominated for the Whitechapel Artist Award, and he was one of 2 artists who received the award, the other being
Matthew
Tickle. And they had a 2-person show, 2 separate solo shows on the top floor of the Whitechapel Gallery.
Cindy Sherman was on the ground floor.
And
actually, going back to the last painting, sorry to interject, but I took the title of the last painting from a Cindy Sherman photograph of her standing by the highway, if you know the one.
Which you would also make a version of as well.
True.
Architecting the Ravine from 1991, and this was the first time that I saw your work. I didn't see your graduate show. But this was, I think, considering the nature of the kind of work you were making, and also the nature of what was being supported then at that time in London, which was the first stirrings of the YBA generation before I had that name. It seemed to me, certainly as someone interested in looking at things, the work I saw at the Whitechapel was viscerally different to everything else that I'd encountered recently by an artist of your generation. And it also seemed to me that for an artist who was barely 12 months out of grad school, quite a significant platform for your work. I mean, did it feel like that at the time, or what were the circumstances of the Whitechapel Artist Award? Because I think it was really the first public manifestation of your work.
Well, I have to say it felt like a major thing for me because of what I associated the Whitechapel with and what I'd seen at the Whitechapel in those same galleries, and to actually have been invited to hang some paintings there was daunting, to say the least.
And by that you mean Guston,
Beckman, Lupert's, so many people. Picasso, Baselitz, Günter Bruss, all sorts of people. So then, to actually imagine your own work hanging in those same room, same light, same space, possibly same visitors. It was daunting. And I can remember actually bringing my paintings in a truck from my studio, which was on Rosebery Avenue, and I'd wrap them up in decorator's plastic, and it was for hanging off them, and we walked them through the Cindy Sherman exhibition. They were unpacking with white gloves out of these incredible crates, and just feeling quite almost embarrassed. I didn't even really want to look at my paintings, actually. Anyway, you had about 8 paintings upstairs, and people came and saw it, but the reaction was quite sort of, I didn't know what to expect, but the reaction was quite sort of muted. The reaction sort of, I would say, came out, some years later when I met the likes of you. I think I met you maybe 2 years later. And then when I first met you, you said you'd seen the show, and that was quite a common thing. Other artists would tell me to see it, but there was no sort of reaction from the art world, as it were.
Yet 25, almost 30 years later, all of the works that you showed at the Whitechapel are now considered significant paintings within the development of your work, or pretty much all of them.
I guess, and also I think the ones I made at Chelsea the year before were also, in retrospect, quite important works. A lot of them led to other works.
But did it feel at that time that you'd figured it out, or you would...
No, not really. But I did. The one thing I did have, which is I realize doesn't happen all the time in your life as an artist, is I felt like I was on a roll as far as having things to paint, and I was excited about painting, and I was managing to get a lot done with actually not thinking about it too much.
And maybe you could just describe what people are looking at, because I think again it's another painting that makes a reference back to your time in Canada shortly before you came to the UK again, and it's also I think the beginning in your work of this sort of tension between the natural world and the vernacular everyday urban world, or in this case modernity.
I suppose when I was at Chelsea, I started to make paintings of man-made structures, yes, within the natural world, and man-made structures that often had a sort of almost sort of like a human element to them. But they were quite, in the first place, they were quite sort of humble, homely type structures, really. And I don't know when I actually took the photograph, which I used partly to make this painting from, but there's a neighbourhood in Toronto which is quite affluent, and it's built into the ravine, and a lot of the kind of homes, mostly which are older homes. This is one of the very few modern homes there, are sort of deliberately built within nature and use nature as a screen to keep themselves private, really. And so I was interested in that, the way that you could actually never really see these houses. They were only really designed to be sort of seen by their owners or the people who had access to them. And so nature was being used as a way of keeping the place private. And then I sort of, I kind of extended that by the way I painted it, and looking at maybe a lot of abstract paintings and seeing, using abstract paintings as a reference in a way to sort of paint nature as well.
And at this time, coming out of the MA program, the Whitechapel show was in '91. I mean, how were you supporting yourself?
I worked at a club in the West End, which I'd worked at for years, working behind the bar, a members club, a small one, and I played ice hockey. I got paid a little bit for playing ice hockey.
You got paid? You're a professional ice hockey player?
Yeah, I mean, in the British League, which was fairly, but I did get, I got like £75 a week to play that, but it all kind of added up.
Myself and Peter met in 1992 through a mutual friend of ours, an artist and writer called Gareth Jones, who had a very important role in a lot of artists' careers at that time in the early 1990s. And he introduced myself and Peter, and we both were in a group exhibition that Gareth organized called Inside a Microcosm, which was at Law Géniard's gallery. Law still has a gallery in London, but it was a tiny space. The gallery was probably 15 feet by 8 feet. And it was also included in the exhibition with Gavin Brown, an artist who'd moved to New York and hadn't yet opened a gallery which soon represent Peter in America. So it was a kind of very interesting moment where a number of people met. Martin Creed was in the same exhibition too.
Hilary Lloyd.
And then in 1993, you're involved with an artist collective and shared studio space called Cubit. And in 1993, myself and Peter co-curated an exhibition, the first exhibition we organized together, of a musician and artist called Billy Childish. And we were both independently fans of Billy Childish and his music, but Peter had actually been at St. Martin's with Billy in 1980 and 1981. So Peter had a much longer history with Billy, and in fact in a lot of Billy's poems from the early 90s there's a character called Pete the Canadian. It's a very sort of thinly disguised Pete the Scottish painter. Maybe you could just say something, because I think at this time, by now the sort of the wheels of the YBA, pre-YBA machine are spinning. But it's clear that there are a lot of other things happening in London that don't necessarily subscribe to that aesthetic or to those dynamics or the sort of the larger logic of the YBA narrative. So you were involved with a group of artists in a shared studio space. You had an exhibition space that you supported together. How was that sort of sense of community important to you as an artist, to your practice, given at that time, 91, 92, there wasn't commercial interest in your work and so on?
Well, I think it was important for me to move into that shared studio situation. Prior to that, I had always worked either on my own or with a very small group in a studio I'd set up on Rosebery Avenue, right opposite the old Air Gallery. Cubitt Street, before it was on Cubitt Street, was on Goods Way in King's Cross, and I happened to live, I used to time it 30 seconds away by bicycle. So I could actually get to the studio in 30 seconds. And it was around the time that my first daughter was born, so that was very useful to be that close to a studio, but also out of the house. But anyway, I joined this collective that had this quite great space on Goods Way, very close to where the new St. Martin's is now. The building no longer exists. And they did have this gallery space, and we had open studios. I'd never really sort of been in a space that had that type of connection to the public, I guess. And just lots of different artists. There were some architects working in there. People came through the building. I mean, I don't think things would have been the same, for instance, if Gareth Jones hadn't come in to see this open studio almost 2 years after the Whitechapel show, and see the work and say, oh, I remember this work, and got into a conversation. The next thing he said, would you like to be in a group show at Laura Geniard that I'd been asked to put on in the summer? And that was the very first time I'd ever had a painting in a kind of commercial gallery space. And that's when I met Matthew, that's when I met Martin Creed, that's when I met Hilary. I mean, I suddenly met artists who were kind of on the same sort of footing as me, sort of starting out, but were just starting to get going, really. And it wasn't part of the main narrative, as you say, but, artists spread out and sort of influences spread through other artists, and, you kind of help each other in a way without maybe thinking you are. And I think that it was really inspiring to put on shows of other artists like Billy Childish's work, an artist who really people found very difficult at the time, it has to be said.
I'm from, the Gareth Jones studio visit when you did the open studios at Cubitt. Gareth wrote what's, widely considered the first article, or the first substantial, I think, writing about your work, which he wrote for a very early issue of Frieze magazine. And through that being published and distributed internationally, people read the article, and obviously there was no internet at that time, they couldn't search for images, but interest from elsewhere began. So the next image on the screen is from 1993.
It's interesting though, because Gareth did write the article, but they changed the headline.
Right.
And they called it something like "Strange Cabins and Weird Folk," which was a kind of Twin Peaksy type take on the word. And that was neither what Gareth I wanted at the time.
Right.
But nevertheless, it was useful images going out in the world, I found, for me.
The next painting's called Blotter. It's from 1993, and in 1995 this painting won you the John Moore's painting prize. So about 18 months after you painted it. But this is a painting that was made at Cubitt, as will be the next image when we get to it. But it seems to me something. What happened around this time? Because it seems to me that between this painting, Blotter, and the works that come after this, the concrete cabin paintings, the scale of the work changed. I think the paintings got bigger, and it seems to me that you're now fully inside your own world within the painting, and you've created this kind of sort of domain.
Well, actually, the paintings didn't get bigger. I think that's one thing I've got in common with Denzel. I always made large paintings, even going back to when I was a student at St. Martin's. So the paintings, and subsequently had to drag and store large paintings. But and I was making these snow paintings at the same time I was making the cabin paintings, which you'll see next. And in my mind, I wanted to exhibit them at the same time. That was the idea, to show them together rather than to separate them into groups. I think with this painting, this painting I made in reaction to another painting I made, which was called Pond Life, which was a kind of more of an imagined reflection of people walking on snow or reflective ice. In this case, I actually got my brother to stand on a frozen pond, and we staged it completely, and it was a staged reflection. It was a pose that I photographed. I think I was quite influenced by the work of Jeff Wall at that point in time, the Canadian photographer who also staged scenarios for his work. And I've actually been looking at his work since I was quite young, because he was from Canada, and I remember him showing like in very small alternative spaces in Toronto. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I was aware, and one of the things I liked about Jeff's work was how plain it was, and how sometimes you didn't really know whether you were looking at a work of something that was from the world of advertising, but there was never any text. Famous one of a man sitting on the side of the street squeezing a milk carton, for instance, or a boy with a backpack. Just things that, when you first saw the work, was so shockingly plain, you wondered why you were actually looking at it. And it's kind of what I wanted to do here as well, was to make something very plain and almost sort of sweet as well.
And we'll go to the next image. And this is from the Concrete Cabin series of paintings. Can you just describe what we're looking at?
This is a view of a building that Corbusier designed. It was actually the last of his unités. The most famous one is in Marseille, which is also the most sculptural. This one is like very plain, pared down, low budget Corbusier, but using the same design, basically, same structure as the other unités. Through some architects I knew who were teaching out of the Architectural Association, I was invited to join a group that took over and renovated the first to third floors of this particular building. The building, it has to be said, had been abandoned. It had been squatted. It was to be condemned, and the building was saved. The building was renovated, but there was these three floors that were left kind of rough, and these architects made a plea for it, and it was going to be a kind of art center, a bit like a kind of cast type situation. Sadly, it never really evolved into that, but it was an interesting time I spent there sort of renovating, and I had no idea that I might paint the building. I just was there sort of literally scraping paint off the inside of the building, scraping varnish off. But then walking around the building and taking photographs of it, I realized that the photographs reminded me of some of the paintings I'd already made, and I thought, well, maybe I can paint this building as well. And so I started, experimenting with these, drawings and photographing and filming it, and getting more and more excited about what I was seeing, really. And,
in 1994, you have your first solo exhibitions in galleries with Victoria Mirror in London, where you showed paintings from the Concrete Cabin series, with Gavin Brown in New York.
mm-hmm.
I think the New York show was first, and then Victoria second. Yeah. And they were both towards the end of 94 into 95.
Yeah.
1994, you were also nominated for the Turner Prize, which, in hindsight, I think seems quite unusual because
hadn't really done anything.
You hadn't really done anything. But certainly at that time, and he didn't win the Turner Prize, by the way.
I lost.
He lost. Anthony Gormley won. But What does the Queen always say for a great year? Annus. Whatever the good year one is. It seems like 1994 was your annus whatever.
Terribilis.
Is that true? I mean, starting to show with galleries obviously is one thing. Being nominated for the Turner Prize is a sort of, certainly within the UK at least, and certainly at that time, is sort of public acknowledgement of an unusual scale for an artist who had, at that point shown relatively little.
Yeah. No, I mean it was very exciting, really. I think surprising to me, but also to a lot of my friends and people who knew me and had known me as a painter since the early '80s. It was like
I think within the history of the Turner Prize, fairly unusual too. I can't remember, but you might have to go back to Malcolm Morley winning it. There wasn't a great deal of figurative painting in the Turner Prize, from my memory of it.
Not really. I mean, I remember Howard Hodgkin was up for it. Lucien Freud was up for it.
Right.
He lost
in the '80s. There's a very good Turner Losers Club.
No, it was incredible thinking back on it, and
but I remember being at the opening. It felt like a big deal.
It was a huge deal. It was very.
And it was you, Willie Doherty, Anthony Gorman, Scherzer.
Yeah. I was just amazed. I mean, it was amazing to have, again, to see your paintings in those rooms, and I think you forget what it's like as an artist. I think going back to Denzel's show yesterday, just the chance to bring your paintings out of a studio and put them in
the Tate.
Some good room,
yeah,
the Tate,
sure.
In my case, the Tate, and those rooms where you'd seen all those shows, and that's the, what does my painting look like in that space? When you've seen all these examples of everything, really. So it was very exciting, yeah. And I mean, as you say, it was the first year that I guess that I was showing in a commercial space as well. But
and then in 1995, you win the John Moore Painting Prize, which I also remember being a big deal. And I think it was a purchase prize, right? And
it is always a purchase prize.
Prize. And I think you received something like £20,000, which at the time seemed like a vast amount of money.
It was a vast amount of money. But I also won another prize that year.
The Herbert Carrion Prize.
Yeah, which I didn't apply for. I was nominated for it. I won it. Actually, two of us won it. We shared the prize. It was myself and an Austrian painter called Herbert Brandl.
This is a prize in Vienna?
In Salzburg. So I went from really having nothing, like zero, nothing, monetarily, to having sort of some money where I could actually think about, buying better materials, buying better stretchers, eventually moving, all these sorts of things.
And around this time in 95, are you teaching at Stourbridge on the foundation course? Or have you stopped teaching at Stourbridge?
I was possibly teaching at the Royal College. I mean, I taught up until last July, but I started in 1991 at Stourbridge in the Midlands teaching the foundation course. And then quite a number of places, but before I left for Trinidad, I was at the Royal College. Could have been the Royal College, or could have been Chelsea, could have been the Slade, one of those places. Yeah.
Given this, new attention to the work, you started to have relationships and representation with galleries. You were nominated for the Turner and the two prizes you won. I mean, how did that affect the work, or did it not affect the work? Or we go to the next painting, which is from 1997. It's called Figure in a Mountain Landscape.
I made this one for the Whitechapel. The second show that I had at the Whitechapel, which was my own show at the Whitechapel.
This was 1998. Peter has his first survey exhibition in the United Kingdom at the Whitechapel Gallery on the ground floor.
The ground floor, yeah. Where Cindy Sherman was before. No, I mean, I think I still had a lot of energy, and I think I still had a lot of things, like new ideas kept on coming. I mean, I think that I've had times prior to this, actually, prior to I went to my return to Chelsea, where I kind of felt like I had, you know, I could, not saying I didn't know what to paint, but I definitely slowed down, and I was kind of clawing at things to paint, and I've had times like that since. But I think still going through this time, it was almost like I didn't have to think about what I wanted to paint, really. I felt like I was just constantly being presented with things. You know, there was like one thing would lead to the next, and I mean, it's not to say that the paintings are easy to make, and I mean, this painting was particularly quite difficult to finish because the figure was wearing this. The figure I wanted to paint was actually a Canadian painter painting in the landscape, and at one point he was white and he looked like a Ku Klux Klan, which is certainly what I didn't want. And then he was black and he looked like a warlock, and I didn't want that either. And I was actually making a lot of etchings at this time, and simultaneously of the same subjects I was making paintings. And I found that some of the experimentations that were happening in the etching studio helped me resolve this painting, and it became more abstract, really, and more. The figure became more about the landscape, I guess, or the figure in a way took on, you know, became part of the painting rather than being in the painting, as it were.
You know, maybe at this point, I mean, this is based on a photograph of
Franklin Carmichael. He was one of the group of 7 who were famous Canadian painters, landscape painters.
You know, maybe it's a diversion. I think, you know, currently at the Tate Modern, there's a room of paintings that includes a painting by Peter from a little bit earlier than this called Ski Jacket, that's also based on photographic imagery. And the room of figurative paintings they have at the Tate that includes Marlene Dumas. The sort of theme of the room is painting's relationship with the media and the use of media or mediated imagery in painting, which obviously Marlene Dumas does a lot, and you've done throughout your career. I mean, maybe as an interesting diversion, just say a few words about that relationship in the work, how the image, before it gets processed through painting and other means.
Well, I mean, I always want to kind of get away from the photograph and leave the photograph, or not make a photographic painting or painting that's a slave to a photograph. But I always find myself going back to that as the beginning, really. But it's just, you know, it's just sort of. It's when to where to abandon it. Do you abandon it right at the very beginning of the painting? Do you just look at it and just use it as a remembrance of something, or are there elements of the photograph that you actually feel that is something that you couldn't achieve either using your imagination or using your skills, your drawing skills?
A lot of your recent gallery exhibitions, including the most recent one that was in New York and then traveled to London at Michael Werner Gallery, I mean, I've noticed in the last 10 years in those exhibitions you've started to show a lot more studies, drawings, versions, variations on imagery, serial repetitions. You've sort of revealed the process of how you arrive at a painting through the exhibition more than perhaps you did in the past.
Well, I think the process often becomes as important as the source in a way, and maybe that's why.
In 1998, you have your first survey exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, and again, you know, I remember at the time it seemed like a big deal, and they published, you know, I think what we considered to be the first monograph on your work. There were other catalogues from exhibitions, but it was the first monograph where, you know, your work was set within the context of its own history. I contributed to that catalogue. I did an inventory of Peter Doig's record collection at the time, 1997. I just went to his studio in London and simply itemized all of the records, the CDs that he had in the studio. So in a sense, it was sort of the soundtrack for the studio, which the argument might have been that it was a soundtrack for the paintings, which I think is a reasonable way to think about or approach your work. But what did it feel like to see your work laid out art historically, chronologically, in relation to itself at the Whitechapel, and at the time or subsequently looking at your work in that sort of through that retrospective lens? I mean, what did you take away from that?
Well, it was 1998, and I mean, I think the earliest painting was made in 1990, so it was only 8 years
Right.
work, really. It was some of the work I'd made in 8 years.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know really. It's hard to answer that question. I mean, I think that it'd be interested to go back now and look at that. I did make quite a lot of new paintings for the show. I mean, there's probably about 5 or 6 new paintings in the exhibition. So that was exciting, I guess. Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to that in 2008 when you have your first Tate retrospective, and then we can see where we were then. We'll move to the next slide, which is from 2001, and it's a painting called 100 Years Ago. It's not exactly this big, but it's not far from being this big. And in the late 90s, you had the Whitechapel show in 98. You were teaching in London at the Royal College of Art. I was also teaching at the Royal College of Art at the same time as you. And in 2000, a fairly obviously now significant event, that you went to Trinidad again for the first time since you'd been there as a child. And you went to Trinidad to take part in a residency, which is where you met Lisa Bryce, who's in the audience tonight. And also I think it's Chris O'Feely went with you at the same time on that residency. And then Trinidad, obviously, and we'll come to this, would have a really substantial and significant part, not just in your personal life, but the work too. But can you just say something about making that first trip to Trinidad and your initial impressions, and then perhaps talk about this painting, because it relates directly to that time in Trinidad, even though the subject in the canoe, I think, is Greg Allman?
It's a member of the Allman
One
Brothers.
of the Allman Brothers bands,
Yeah.
so not so Trinidadian.
It's not a portrait, but yeah.
But yeah, Trinidad 2000.
Well, it was interesting because Chris and I worked in the same studio in King's Cross, same Cubit. It had moved, and Chris knew that I'd lived in Trinidad as a child, and he told me he'd been invited to do a residency there, and he was wondering whether he should accept it or not, whether he should leave London for a month, and I said yes. I said yes, I think you should. And I said, and tell them that I have a history of Trinidad as well. So he did, and luckily I got invited as well, and so we went together, and this is where we met Lisa. But we were there for a month, and I hadn't been back for 33 years, and didn't really know what to expect going back, kind of as a white man to sort of former colony, and Trinidad had been long independent since '61. I didn't know whether how I would be thought of, really, and so it was interesting going into that situation, and I met a lot of artists, a lot of Trinidadian artists, met a lot of local people, and I felt quite welcomed, really, and I felt very excited about seeing the place again, having this long gap, and I realized like how much the place, how familiar it felt, really, and I felt I was seeing things that I wanted to paint, seeing things I wanted to sort of talk about in my paintings, that really excited me, and I think over the next 2 years I went back, I think 12 times. I took every opportunity I could to go back to Trinidad, even if it was just for a few days. I remember, like, for instance, Chris and I were in a group exhibition in Los Angeles, and they were paying for us to fly to Los Angeles. And I said to Chris, I said, how much do you think it would cost if we flew to Los Angeles via Trinidad? And it cost us like an extra £100. So we went London, Trinidad, spent 3 days in Trinidad, then Trinidad, Los Angeles, then London, way back. So it really sort of, got to both of us, really. And I think we were both painting things that we'd inspired by there, and it was probably quite competitive in a way, and but I think in a really good way. And we were actually working in the same studio again. He was upstairs and I was on the ground floor. We'd be up and down the floors, checking on each other. And,
but at that point in the late 90s, I mean, I left the UK in 2001 and moved to the United States, and certainly in the latter part of the 1990s, the sort of noise around the YBA or the post-YBA and the sort of reception of contemporary art in the British mainstream press was just sort of like this noise that was permanently in the background, and it felt to me that, certainly on my personal sense, it felt like just an interesting time to leave the UK, and I went to California and then eventually to New York. But you went to Trinidad, but was there some sense on your part that it was a useful time to displace yourself, your practice, and some of the things you were thinking about somewhere else?
Well, you have to remember I had three children then, actually 4. And the oldest one was 10. And I thought, growing up in the centre of London, she was kind of quite streetwise and quite cocky. But I thought within sort of very sort of narrow parameters. I mean, she hadn't really lived anywhere other than central London. And I thought about my own life, my own past, and I just thought how blessed I had been really by the fact that my family, by whatever circumstance, we'd lived in so many different places. So yes, I was inspired by Trinidad, and I was making paintings of Trinidad. I could probably have stayed in London, and carried on. But I thought maybe this is an opportunity and I could afford it then as well. Maybe I could make this move with my family and allow them to have an experience kind of like what I had. I thought we'd probably... And the other thing I have to remember is I did have an exhibition that I'd been offered in a rather big exhibition in Munich at the Pinakothek, and so I had 2.5 years to make these paintings for this exhibition. So I thought, let's go to Trinidad. I had a space I could work there because I knew the people who ran the art centre where I'd worked. We can live in Trinidad for a few years and then come back, maybe. But still there.
And this painting from 2001, I mean, maybe we can just say somewhere, was this painting made in London?
The funny thing was, when we were in Trinidad for the residency, the studios that we were to be working in were not complete. And so we had all this time on our hands, and we rented a car. And so we just actually did what we should have done without thinking about it. It was just to see the island and get to know the island and get to know different parts of the city. I mean, Port of Spain's a big, quite cosmopolitan city. There's 900,000 people there. And so there was not much time in the studio. But when we were in the studio, Chris and I were down the hall from each other, and we were, what are we going to paint? This is all a bit strange. We just got here. How can you make paintings about here? And I brought all these small canvases with me, and one of them had these 2 figures, which I ended up putting in a painting called Gastoff. And it was just these 2 figures. And I was tearing the canvas off to stretch another one, and Chris said, wait a minute. He said, give me that. And he took it away into his studio. And then like an hour later he came back and he painted this sort of afro head on one of my figures. And he gave it back to me. And so then I painted some more on it and I gave it back to him. And so we spent the rest of our time making these kind of jokey tropical paintings that were kind of like mocking each other's work as well. And we still have them actually. And so we made all these paintings, small paintings. And then there was 2 big paintings that we still haven't finished. One of them was, I started, and it was this canoe. And the island is an island we saw on a sailing trip. Someone took us on a sailing boat, and there's this island not far off the coast of Port of Spain called Curator, and there's an old English garrison on there, which is now kind of like a maximum security prison, and it's like something from a movie, like a kind of Devil's Island situation, and it's all lifers, and but from a distance it looks a bit like a villa, but as you get closer you realize there's sort of armed guards at sea level, and so I'd taken pictures of this, not really knowing what it was at first, and I thought it was ominous, but also quite alluring as well.
And then the Southern Rocker in a canoe.
Well, you do meet some sort of wastrels out there, and people who are kind of lost went there. I remember meeting someone who'd, had been in Trinidad for like the last 20 years and just sort of ducking and diving, and these sort of white guys who sort of have ended up in this situation, and they're almost like sort of, genuine pirates of the Caribbean, or just someone who's a lost soul or whatever. And I just, that was this person who's sort of adrift. But, in many ways it was, the painting got its influence from a Matisse painting I saw in St. Louis. I'd had an exhibition in St. Louis in the museum, and I had the opportunity to look at the Matisse painting, the Three Bathers with the turtle painting, almost every day for the 10 days that I was there. And I was really taken by that painting, and in a way this painting was very much influenced by that painting. I don't know if the audience know it. I'm sure you do.
In 2002 you moved to Trinidad, and in the studio complex that you worked at, which I visited, but I'm sure most people are aware that you started a weekly film club called Studio Film Club. Peter's had a very large studio. The studio is bigger than the room we're in now. But where he painted was in a smaller room to the side. So the studio where he made the work is actually very small. But the rest of the studio is huge. So it's this big empty space. And you turned it into a cinema with a real cinema speaker system. And you screened films on a weekly basis, for which you made a hand-painted, unique poster each week. And as far as I understand it, you were showing films that, for the most part, hadn't been screened commercially in Trinidad, and or films that you wanted to see, recent films that weren't being distributed in the Caribbean. But could you just say something about the Studio Film Club, but also the motive for doing that, and then also how it sort of worked again within a shared studio complex, but also within the community of artists and filmmakers and musicians in Trinidad?
Well, the space I had in Trinidad was an interesting space. It's an old rum factory. It's a big building, and as Matthew said, it was two spaces really that were 5,000 square feet each, big open spaces with a big high galvanized roof, and then open the elements on the side. And it's where they stored big, kegs of rum or whatever. The art center that we were invited to occupied the front of this building, and that had been renovated. The back of the building was still unrenovated and very, very like a raw space, really. And when I was in Trinidad for the residency, I asked the landlords if I could use this space to make these paintings for this exhibition I described in Munich. So they said yes. But as Matthew said, it was this big space, and it was big, and it was dusty, and it was hot, and very, very hard to keep clean. And so I painted in this much smaller space, but I had access to this huge space. One of the spaces, myself and one of my artist friends would play racquetball in daily. And the other space, I decided that let's screen some films and invite people in, because the art center also was not getting so many people coming in on a regular basis. And so I thought, well, this is a way of bringing people into the building every Thursday night, so they could watch films, but they could also visit the artists who were working in the studio if they cared to open up their studios. And the first poster I didn't make a poster until about second screening, and I thought I should put a poster up just to alert people there's going to be a film screening that night. And the film was Black Orpheus, the Brazilian carnival film. And I was actually working on a painting using one of the other guys in the Allman Brothers band, who was the drummer, and he happened to be black. And it was a work on paper that I'd been working on, and I wasn't particularly happy with it, so I just wrote Black Orpheus on it because it had this reflection and it seemed to make sense. And then I wrote Studio Film Club Tonight or something like that on it and pinned it up on the wall. And then I started doing it each week. And I mean, they were never meant to be works of art, they were just meant to be announcements like you would have in a college like this. If someone's putting on an event or whatever, they'd put a poster up for a disco. I just happened to paint them by hand. But the interesting thing about the film club was it introduced me to so many people in Trinidad. I got to know so many people through the film club, and I deliberately chose my co-host, who still is a good friend of mine, but he was a guy who, from Port of Spain, also had been active on the kind of party scene in Port of Spain. So he had a big mailing list of people. And so when we announced the films, we'd send out these emails to a very, very big, broad group of people. And, by word of mouth or whatever, people started to come. Studio Film Club, not because it was exclusive, but club because it had an atmosphere of being like a club, like a nightclub, as well as being a film club. When I arrived in Trinidad, there was a film festival on that showed interesting new films and documentaries. But other than the 2 weeks that that film festival was on, the only films you could see in Trinidad were either very mainstream Hollywood or very mainstream Bollywood. And so I kind of wondered to myself, where do the people who were attending these screenings during the festival, where do they go to watch films or whatever when there's no festival on? And that's why I started it. And we started off by screening films that I thought would somehow reflect upon local people's lives. And then I thought, after a while, I just thought, well, that's wrong, really. We should just show films that are good films, really. And so if you actually look at the list of films we showed, I think we did almost 400 nights over the years. It was a very, very wide range of films.
Whilst that's happening, in 2008, you have, as I mentioned before, you had a retrospective at Tate Britain. Was it called Tate Britain then?
Yes, it was.
Tate Britain. Which I also remember is a big deal. And yeah. And the last room of that painting exhibition included some very recent paintings from your time in Trinidad, including a great painting of Amber as a bat and so forth. And is it possible to say what effect Trinidad had on the work, has on the work, continues to have on the work? Because it's clearly, certainly the way that the work is shown now and received, and when you organize retrospectives, work from the last decade and a half is made or associated or as Trinidad in its sort of DNA. And then people think about the work through that lens, perhaps more than they ever did through the Canadian lens in the 90s.
Well, interestingly, now I've lived in Trinidad longer than I ever lived in Canada. If I had the two times I lived there together, I don't know. I think it's a place that's, with a very complicated and interesting history, very strong culture of its own. That's very attractive. as an outsider, really. I think if you went to a culture that looked outwards, that would be very different than being in a place where there's a great confidence within their own culture. I mean, I don't think Trinidadians really need for much outside of their own culture. They really feel very confident in their own culture, in their own music, in their own carnival, in their own writing. So that, to me, I think that's an important thing. I met some great artists there. One artist you mentioned, Emba, who was self-taught, and he worked in the same studio as Lisa and I, Chris for a while, and just a very, very inspiring individual, and with a very fresh approach to art making that had nothing to do with anything from our art world, really. Matthew and I actually organised an exhibition at White Columns of his work as well.
Did your status as, you described arriving in 2000 with Chris, meeting Lisa on the residency as having somewhat outsider status, arriving in a place that you hadn't lived in for more than 30 years nearly. How has that relationship with Trinidad changed now that you've lived there effectively for 17 or 18 years?
I think
you're not a local, obviously.
Not a local. I'm a resident. It's complicated. I mean, people know about my work there.
But you've never shown there, as far as I'm aware.
I have shown there in smaller shows.
Right.
But to be honest, there's no place to show bigger paintings really, and there's no spaces even like where we were last night in a Prudential show in St. Just. I mean, of that scale rather. So people tend to visit artists in their studio and see what they're making in their studios. It's complicated in the fact that, and I don't want to be a Trinidadian artist. I don't want to represent Trinidad. I really don't, because I think there's artists who should be representing Trinidad and hopefully will be seen to be the ones who do, but not me.
Maybe you could say something about the painting that's on the screen now. It's from 2015. It's called Rain in Ports of Spain. And I think the first time it was shown was in an exhibition of your work in Venice, in a former palazzo in 2015. And the subject of the lion, the subject of this prison in downtown Port of Spain.
Yeah. Well,
there's a recurring motif.
Yeah. There's a prison in the centre of Port of Spain which occupies a big city block, and it is downtown really. And I mean, the people I know who've been in the prison, you don't want to go in the prison, have told me what it's like on the inside. It's basically open to, it's like an open courtyard, a massive open courtyard situation. The cells are around the side. So when you're in the prison, in the cells, you can actually hear the street. You can hear, I mean, at carnival time, the carnival exists around the prison. I mean, people I think have been known to throw things over the walls to, people in the yard, like cell phones and what have you, even though it's quite a high wall. The prison was built by the British, of course. It's this kind of almost Coleman's mustard yellow, and it's constantly being painted and repainted, and it has this typical sort of green, almost like park bench type green doors. These doors are actually from the lion's cage in the Port of Spain Zoo, which have exactly the same green. And I won't go into the details of it, but one of my daughters got into trouble with the law. She didn't end up in this prison. But there was a situation where for over 3.5 years I had to go to, we had to go to a small town outside of Port of Spain while she was on whatever, probation, parole or something like that, to this situation, and seeing all the guys, same guys every time, being dragged across from this the prison opposite, which is similar to this one, in manacled, and then sitting in the courtroom manacled and then being led back. And a lot of them were Rastafarians. A lot of them had been picked up for petty, I mean, all of them petty crimes. They wouldn't have been in that situation if they were serious crimes, like, you know, minor drug offences, theft, what have you. And it's a problem. The prisons are very overcrowded, and I'm sure the same problem here. But I think I made this analogy between the prisoners and the lions in the zoo, and then also the fact that the Lion of Judah is such a prominent motif in that society. It's almost like a motif you see almost on a daily basis painted on walls, or it's this kind of Christ-like stand-in.
And we'll just go to the last image, and we've been talking for nearly an hour, so we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, and we're very happy to encourage questions from the audience. And we'll just end on this painting, which was made last year in 2017, and it was included in Peter's exhibition at Michael Werner Gallery, first in New York, and then the same exhibition, or version of the exhibition, traveled to Michael Werner's gallery in New York. And it's one of the most recent large-scale paintings you've made.
Yeah.
Maybe just, in summing up, just say a few words about this painting, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, I mean, I could talk for a while about it, but I mean, it was really a painting that was affected by recent events that happened nearby where I live in Trinidad, and recent events that were sort of happening in the news as well. The imagery came from, some of the imagery is kind of inspired by what was happening in Charlottesville, the camouflage. The filming, the guy with the camera filming what's happened or happening came from an incident that I'd seen on the internet whereby these guys had filmed this man drowning on their cell phones and posted on the internet rather than actually sort of attempting to save him. The central character, in my mind, was someone who's done a deed that he regrets doing, and maybe has been talked into doing, and is in that moment of just remorse or whatever. There's a lot of, I mean, Trinidad for all. There's a lot of gang violence there. Every day in the newspaper, there's another killing at least daily. I mean, it's from the time that I moved there in 2002 to now, the deaths per day have multiplied at least 3 or if not 4 times. It's an epidemic really, but it's within the gang world. But then, you hear the stories through people I know, people who live close to me, and you wonder how does a young man get into a situation where he does something like that, takes a life. That's it. A bit of a sad.
Try and cheer it up. But I was curious about this painting, so I haven't discussed it with you, but the figure on the audience's left.
Yeah.
It seems like an ice hockey player has drifted into the scene somehow. And I mean, it's tempting to read it autobiographically that it's the former professional ice hockey player, Peter Doig.
No, it was an ice, because I do play ice hockey still when I'm in New York, and the thing in Charlottesville had just happened, and a team came on the ice, a recreational team after we'd been playing, and they were all wearing camouflage, and I just thought, being in America, and it just looked wrong really. They should be playing a sport wearing camouflage, like Desert Storm type.
On ice as well.
Yeah, so I kind of made out like camouflage. I mean, I don't know where you could hide wearing that one. In a disco maybe, but the painting started off as 3 musicians, and one of them was going to be Emba, our friend Emba, and 2 other Trinidadian musicians who I admire, and I suppose influenced partly by, not in style, but by the Picasso musician paintings, hence the Harlequin, which I made out. But then it kind of just changed, and it changed. And I still want to make the musician painting, but this one took on another tone, I think, very much affected by the times.
Before we open it up to questions from the floor, could you just say what you're working on now or working towards, if you're able to do that?
I'm working towards a show that opens in Vienna in April next year, and just a mixture of paintings. I can't really.
And you're making work in London, Trinidad, and New York simultaneously?
No, I'm making work in Trinidad and New York at the moment.
With that, we're very happy to open it up to any questions or comments from the floor. And feel free to put your hand up.
Andy?
I was just curious, you implied earlier...
This man has no shoes on, by the way.
Must be local.
You implied earlier that there were moments where things are on a roll and things kind of not necessarily come easily, but you kind of know what you're up to, implying that there are some times that are bereft or kind of leaner. And I just wondered, I remember, I think it was Thomas Struth said that the one thing that Richter said to him when teaching him was that if you get stuck, you just work on something else rather than sort of trying to sit there with this kind of problem. But I just wondered what strategies you have when you have those like leaner periods of like what to paint or how to paint or how to engage with work, like whether you have any strategies that you really use.
I don't really, and I think that's something that I could address maybe. I admire people who just in a way can work. To me, it's always been more about. I don't really see painting as being like a job, really, or like a kind of I have to be working the whole time. I don't really mind if I'm not working. I can be quite relaxed. I don't have to do it every day, like say. Although I admire the way like Frank Auerbach works, that's not me really. So I kind of tend to try and work out the thing I'm working on rather than just move on to the next.
So sometimes you just leave it alone as well.
Leave it alone for a long time, yes.
As in just do work.
Yeah, I mean at the moment, for instance, someone said, "What am I painting?" Well, actually, there are many paintings, not many, but there's maybe 10 paintings that I want to at some point finish, and that's what I will do. I'll go into those. I'm going into those, yeah.
But this week you're not making paintings.
Didn't bring any with me.
Other questions from the floor? Can be about anything, literally. Yep.
How do you know when a painting's finished?
We had a funny conversation yesterday. If you go to Tate Modern, as I mentioned before, you can see a painting by Peter right now called Ski Jacket. It's from 1995.
Around then, yeah.
And the Tate acquired that painting around the time it was made.
Turner Prize. Yeah.
Turner Prize time. And 94 then. So Peter told me that a collector in the UK was interested to buy a painting by Peter's, and he went to Peter's studio, and that painting was in progress in the studio, and it was sort of earmarked for this collector that he might buy this painting. And then the same collector then saw the painting at the Turner Prize exhibition somewhere.
Yeah.
He saw the painting at the Turner Prize exhibition and decided he didn't want to buy it, and he told Peter he didn't want to buy it because it didn't look finished.
No, in his opinion, it wasn't finished.
In his opinion, it wasn't finished. So I guess the one answer to the question is that it's subjective, but what would your answer be?
Well, it took me a long time to be, I think, brave enough to leave elements of the painting open, really. And I think that, even if you look at a Velázquez painting, there's areas where that are actually quite open. And But I think prior to making paintings like that one, I felt like I had to sort of cover I had to touch every single part of the painting in a way. And
So like the architect's house in the ravine would be a good example. It's a really all over.
it's quite all
painting.
over, yeah. And I think pretty much all the paintings prior to that. And yes, the guy was probably right. I mean, up until that point in time, the paintings were much more sort of, all over. And there are elements of that painting that are very open. But it's like when someone comes into your studio. I remember when I was a student at St. Martin's, Bruce McLean used to come in and do the occasional day teaching, and he was always great to talk to, but he always used to say, "Don't touch it, stop now," and you literally just started it. And, it was just like you'd done, and he was probably right actually, but to have the courage, not just the courage, but also you've stretched that canvas and you've made this frame like this, and you've spent 10 minutes working on it. Is it done? So I mean, it's a real lesson in yourself. You've got to be able to see your own work. You've got to learn how to see your own work, really. And what is your own work? Is your own work sort of like every single element finished, or do you want to try and leave some space? Can you afford to leave space in your work? Same if you're a filmmaker, I'm sure. It's like if you're a filmmaker, how do you edit film? How many passages of space do you leave? Or as a musician too, how much time is there between one bass note and all those things?
Peter, does it mean that when you start a painting like this, you don't really know what the painting is about until you're halfway through it?
Yeah, because I actually started that one 9 years ago, and I finished it, I think, 9 years after I started it, and I knew I wanted to paint the trees, and I knew I wanted to paint, this idea of looking from. I mean, I know exactly where those trees are. They're outside my house. It doesn't look quite like that, and I wanted to paint the horizon, and I wanted to paint this long view to elsewhere. But I didn't know really how much further to go, so I actually spent a long time just painting just the trees. And then the figures came in much later. The figures only came in last summer.
All those things in mind, how many paintings do you lose?
Well, I try not to lose any, in the sense that I put them aside, and they may change. I mean, I may paint completely over them, but I much prefer painting on top of something rather than on top of nothing. So even if the thing was a complete disaster, I think I could turn it around upside down or whatever, and I might like the tops. I mean, the one thing I didn't change in all the time was the two top strips of colour, because I liked the fact that they were very dull and very faded, probably too, by time.
And back to the guy that thought the painting was unfinished. We looked at it on a cell phone yesterday, and we thought he might have actually had a point. Over there, I think there's a question. Yeah.
When you're living in the Caribbean, do you miss the winter and the snow and ice?
I mean, I'm lucky enough to travel quite a bit, so I never really fully miss it. So, but I do, and I don't really consider. I mean, I lived in London for 30 years. I don't really consider London to have a proper winter. I haven't lived in Canada now, where you have a proper winter since 1989. So I haven't really had that experience of a full winter for a long time. And to experience a winter from October to May is an experience. But
And we have time for a couple of more questions, so feel free. Right at the back.
Can you tell us a bit more about the exhibition in St. Just and why you are championing this man's work and why it's in St. Just?
That's an awesome question.
why it's in St. Just? You start. Yeah.
I'll speak I mean, I was introduced to the work of Denzel Forrester, who's here tonight, and feel free to say hello after the talk and introduce yourself to him. But I was introduced to his work by Peter Doig about 2.5 years ago, and to my great shame, and I think my great embarrassment, I wasn't aware of Denzel's work. Denzel had graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1983, and had made work since then, but around 1990, the beginning of the 1990s, he started to show his work less often, and then not at all. So, not to make an excuse, but there was less opportunity to be aware of Denzel's work. And he had a touring exhibition organised by the Arts Council that started in Preston at the Harris Library in the late 80s, and then travelled to some regional venues, but not to London, where I was living at the time. So anyhow, I was unaware of Denzel's work, but Peter introduced it to me, and Peter had seen Denzel's degree show at the Royal College of Art in 1983 when Peter was at Central St. Martin's as an undergraduate. And Peter had tracked Denzel's work, but hadn't met him until much later. And I think both of us, were just astonished by Denzel's work, and the work Denzel was making in the early 1980s. He was making large-scale figurative paintings that dealt with an Afro-Caribbean experience in London. On the one hand, he was making paintings in dub reggae clubs, mostly in East London, of the scenes in dub reggae clubs and the people that went to those parties, mostly by a very famous dub DJ called Josh Shaka. And on the other hand, he was making paintings that were about the policing of the Afro-Caribbean community at the turn of the 1980s. And these are just incredibly powerful paintings about a time in recent memory, recent British history, that for the most part hadn't been privileged in contemporary art, and certainly hadn't been privileged recently in the last 15, 20 years in contemporary British art. But these were paintings from 30-odd years ago that still are just incredibly pertinent, strangely prescient about our current scenario and situation in the UK with the Windrush generation and so forth. But Denzel continued to make amazing paintings throughout the 1980s and beyond, so we decided to organise 2 exhibitions of Denzel's work, focusing on the work he made in the 1980s. The first exhibition was in London at a space that Peter runs in London called Tramps, which was Peter's former studio. It's right behind the McDonald's in Islington. And Paranaz, Mogadassi, Peter's partner. They run the gallery together, and they have a branch of it now in New York City. And the second exhibition of Denzel's work took place at White Palms in New York, the space that I've run for the last 14 years. And as I've said, those 2 shows were really about Denzel's work made in the early 1980s when Denzel was a young man. And then we had an opportunity through Teresa Glello and CAST and the Groundwork initiative to make an exhibition in Cornwall, which is where Denzel lives. Denzel lives in Truro. And the exhibition of the Jackson Foundation that opened last night is really a survey of Denzel's work produced over the last 4 decades, starting in the late 70s with a painting he actually made in St. Just on one of his earliest visits to Cornwall. And the current exhibition is really thinking about Denzel as a contemporary artist in the present tense. So the emphasis of the show is on recent paintings made in 17 and 18, and then thinking about those works in relation to the work he made in the 1980s. So there's a number of key works from the 1980s in the exhibition. And it's really by way of reintroducing Denzel's work in the context of the community that he lives in. And, as we said last night at the opening, there was an incredible opening last night, and the poet Linton Kwesi Johnson read, and he read from poems that were contemporaneous with Denzel's work from the early 1980s that described the same situations Denzel was painting about, but in words, and also in music when Linton made records at that time. It was really just thinking about how the narratives in Denzel's practice, are important, and we have an opportunity to present them again to new audiences, with the hope that the audience for Denzel's work will grow. I think we both think that Denzel's among the most important British artists of the past 40 years. We both feel that his work is underknown, and we both feel that going forward, I mentioned it last night, that an ambition is that someone will organize, a full retrospective of Denzel's work and establish the context in which and the times in which Denzel was making the works, because in a strange way his work is almost like a form of reportage on the culture in the UK at that time, the social and political circumstances in the UK at those times, and then where Denzel finds himself now as an older person, as an older artist, thinking about his own work, both retrospectively, about the past, about the present, and about the future. So some of those things were, the motives for doing this, but at root it's just, our enormous admiration and respect for Denzel and what he does. And, we know that the response to the shows in London and New York, which were quite modest exhibitions, was really extraordinary and unprecedented, I think. And we hope that momentum keeps going.
Can't really say anything else. Although...
I think you've said interesting things to me, that when you were a young artist in London in the early 80s, that you and your friends from from St. Martin's went to see Denzel's graduate show at the Royal College of Art and were just blown away by the ambition, not only the ambition of the works, but what the works were.
I think I would have been terrified being a fellow student of Denzel's. Just the kind of energy he had and seemed to have, and the work he was making when he was at the Royal College. Yeah, I mean, it was great to see Denzel's work at the time. If you consider what was happening in painting, we've already mentioned Beckmann, Guston, new spirit in painting. There was a real re-interest in painting, and it was very much reflected in the painting departments in art schools. And Beckmann went through London art schools like a rash, and then Guston after that, and Basquiat as well. But Denzel's, I'm not saying interpretation of it, but Denzel's painting, sure, it was influenced by things like that, and it was influenced by, other things, drawing, and the person who ran the Royal College of Art, Peter Doig at the time. But he had his own subject, and the subject was being addressed in music, like the music of Linton Kwesi Johnson, the music of many other people, and in literature. But there were very few people making paintings with the type of ambition that Denzel had of that subject, and it was very exciting to see. And then I remember having the opportunity to visit a fellow student friend of mine who was in Rome, and seeing one of Denzel's huge paintings hanging up in Rome, and he was painting same kind of subjects with a twist in Rome, and I found that very interesting and exciting as well. So there was a woman who came last night called Anne Walmsley, and she's written extensively on art in the Caribbean, and I met her in Trinidad in the early 2000s, and got into a conversation with her, and I asked her if she remembered a painter called Denzel Forrester, and she said yes, of course, and she sent me a postcard when she returned to the UK of one of Denzel's painting of Winston Rose in the back of a police van, and it had his address on it, and I remember writing to him, and that was the first contact I made with him. It was kind of the mid-2000s, and a woman I know had been invited to curate, I think, the first Tate Triennial, which I don't think exists anymore, and she contacted me and she said, was there anyone I could suggest to look at? And I suggested Denzel's work. I think she did go to see you, but he wasn't in the exhibition. But so that was a kind of first attempt I sort of made to sort of try and get people to look.
I think it in a different way. It goes back to both mine and Peter's experience of working within artist-run spaces. I was involved with Cubit for many years too, through meeting Peter and other people at Cubit, and artists creating opportunities and platforms for other artists is pretty much, I think, been how both mine and Peter's entire careers have evolved. They both came out of artists supporting artists, and certainly in New York at White Columns, that's what White Columns exists to do. And I think certainly through a lot of the initiatives Peter and his friends in Trinidad have been doing too, it's about creating opportunities for other people, and the minute you have access to opportunities, I think you have an obligation to share them with as many people as possible, audiences and artists. We have time for one more question, so it's better be an amazing question. Just send us all off into the night. Who's got that amazing question? There you go.
Why does Denzel Forrester live in Truro?
Well, he's right here, so he can answer that question.
Well,
I couldn't possibly, after having been here, I couldn't possibly answer that.
Denzel, Truro, discuss.
I've been coming to Cornwall for over 30 years now. Well, the first time I came to Cornwall was 1977 when I was at Central School of Art with one of my tutors, David Houghton. We had an exhibition at the beginning of this year, in fact, in Penley, in Penzance. And then I found that my partner, who I met in Stoke Newington in an art room, and we were both about 16, I realised her parents have a place down here since 1956. They bought a cottage for £95 in 1956. So we've been coming down here 3 times a year, Christmas, summer, Easter. They were brilliant to us. They started a place called Islington Arts Factory in Camden Road, opposite Holloway Women's Prison. They were amazing, amazing couple. Her dad was a painter and mum did contemporary dance. And they retired in 91 to come to Cornwall and enjoy themselves, paint and dance. So we helped run the factory, and because they were so good to us when we were starting our young art lives, we decided to come down earlier and basically spend more time with them before we're all going to go sometime. And they died within 2 years of us moving. Just pretty sad. So that's why we came earlier. But we would have come down anyway to Cornwall because we love it. And it reminds me of the West Indies a bit when I was a kid. Because I came to London when I was 10 and a half. No, 11 and a half. So the first time I came to Cornwall, it always reminded me of Grenada. But love it.
In an interview with The Guardian a couple of weeks ago before your exhibition in St. Just, you said that even though that you've been living here for a couple of years full time now and that you've been visiting for 30 years, Cornwall still hasn't really affected your work yet. It's too soon almost.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what will happen with my work. It's interesting, since I've moved down here, I've gone back to Grenada more, subject matter and things like that, which is interesting. But it's what is the beauty about moving to a new place? Because I remember when I was in Rome, I got more energy of painting London nightclubs when I was in Rome, in the centre of Villa Borghese. When I lived in New York, I was more excited about painting police vans in New York City. So as a painter, I think it's good to move to places, every 5 or 10 years, because it really it brings more energy into your work. It brings something into your work, because I think there are other elements that affects the way you paint rather than just the subject matter. It might use the same subject matter, but it changes things in it, which you can see after, my partner noticed it more than me, in fact, because you sometimes are so involved in it, it's difficult for you to see.
Okay, I'm afraid it's my job to wrap everything up this evening. So, Denzel, thank you very much for your contribution as well to the talk. I was going to ask a question. I was going to ask Peter and Matthew to give, if they were talking to their younger selves, what advice would they give themselves? Because we have students graduating this week from Falmouth School of Art, but I think that you actually answered the question by saying you need to support one another. We need to do things together and collaborate and make things happen by, just supporting one another. So thank you very much this evening for a terrific conversation and for giving us so much candour around the work and about your relationship and so on. So please everyone join me in giving us